Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Kotchak. I'm the founder CEO of Chemical Q Device here for Thursday, May 30th, 2024. This is 137 discussion, local generative AI models and for drug discovery as well. So what we see here is basically these 6 different platforms, and you may have heard of some of these. You've probably heard of Hugging Face, and a lot of these you have the option to do local online. But if you talk about anything like the upcoming, phone launches, you typically want all of the user data private. So that's why they're making these are actually large multimodal models, and you're going to see these types of platforms as well. And so basically, with Olama, it's very big, and you'll see this different type of format. I've seen this even for fine-tuning models. GGUF, which is Generated Content Guidance User Feedback. And it's a type of format that basically is preferable for LLM and LMM research to better analyze and improve GenAI model performance. Now, multimodal models in specific are picking up on additional support. The ones on Olama I did not see as far as multimodal, but I do know that they support them. So meaning if you downloaded it on your own and got it to work that way. Now, the desktop app, I wasn't unfortunately able to get working on this current setup. And I use the actually terminal to use Olama, and you'd be surprised how far you can go by just using prompts, in VS Code terminal. It's not, anything that's that difficult. The hardest thing you'll have is probably with your specific setup with VS Code if you haven't used it in a while. So obviously the big benefits here, get up and running with large language models locally. Olama also has a REST API for running and managing models. So this is what I did is basically after I fixed a bunch of things on my end with my terminal and VS Code and Ubuntu, sudo snap install Olama run Llama 3. So if you don't know, so Llama 3 came out, over a month ago, and it's kind of like the cutting edge performance, especially for open source. And you can use it all these different ways as long as your user base does not exceed 700 million users in a month, which at that point, you're probably more of a competitor. So it's pretty open, and I typed in this prompt. So it's just like, it's just like if you use terminal, but in VS Code, how has generative AI been used to advance cancer drug discovery? And it says this, it says generative AI has revolutionized cancer drug discovery by providing novel insights, accelerating the process and improving the accuracy of target identification. So when it went on for 4 different bullet points here, this is number 1, and it gave a very good response. Now, the pros of using, local LLMs is you can have your tokens as much as you want. You're not getting charged, right? So say, for instance, if you use something like GPT 3.5 Turbo versus GPT 4.0, it's 10 times the amount for both input and output tokens. So you're more defined by, how much storage do you have? And these models, if you download the original Llama 3, which in this one, it was actually a 4 or 5 gig, it's a quantized version. Okay, so it's not the full 16 gigabytes. Now that's an issue. If you're limited on RAM, if you don't have 16 gigabytes of RAM for the full model. So if you're, and I'll show you a little bit later, if you're shopping for laptops, these types of things, where should you start at in order to run these locally? So you have the privacy of the, user data on board, it's not being sent to some LLM. And that's the huge thing. And so you're going to have to be concerned a little bit about hardware. The kind of default with this, if you want to do it like effectively, seems to be like a MacBook Pro, and those start, somewhere, high 2000s, on up. And, so basically the response is very good for this. On my specific hardware, this Inference 5620, it's a little old, 16 gigs of RAM, and some of that's being used for the system. Core i7, and then this is 12 threads on Ubuntu. So it was slow. It was like 4 or 5 tokens a second. Now, if I go over to Grok and did this, online, they're up to like high 900s, sometimes over 1,000 tokens a second. So token is basically a numerical representation of a word. So if I've seen in one thing, on average, like about 1,000 words is 1,600 tokens, something like that. It's comparable in size. So it does depend on the hardware that you have in specific. Now, Nomic is another one too. So this GPT for all, and with this one, I was actually able to get this up and running for the desktop client. If you haven't done this yet, I would really recommend to get a desktop client up and running because it really just reduces complexity. It can be more reliable if you haven't 100% figured out your setup in terminal, if you're writing, Python scripts. And it gives you an option in a lot of these to change temperature. You can change p values and k, top k values as well. So that's a big thing. So they're kind of what they advertise here is basically this. It's 3 to 8 gigabyte models, and a lot of these, like I said, are quantized. Now, if you're not familiar with this term quantized, what it basically means is if you have a float 16 or float 32, is it's counting those digits after the decimal point. So if it goes to int 4 or int, let's just say int 4, and it instead of being 1234.1234, and int 4 will only be the integer, so nothing after the decimal point. So that allows the models to get a lot smaller. So instead, on average, most of these I download are like between 4 and 5 gigabytes if you're looking at like an 8 billion parameter, for instance. And then, so their big thing is the data. So this database, this Atlas platform that you can opt into, you don't even have to provide your name. And they're thinking this is kind of like the wave of the future of basically what I'm mostly talking here is the local development of LLMs and LMMs, and then everything that surrounds it. So you're going to want to have, these databases built up that you could use locally, unplug from the internet or disconnect, software wise. And then, it's more like a commercial model instead of sending all your data up to the web. So it's just different considerations, and I'll go over some of those a little bit more. Now, if you haven't ever done these, the preference seems to be with the macOS. And this specific one, they say model slightly easier to use. They use this term Apple Silicon or Apple Metal. So Apple Silicon applies to, all of the Apple models, post all of this, having to farm out other GPUs and other manufacturers. Now, Apple Metal in specific is for the kind of the MacBook Pro. So that's in specific the GPU. Actually, you can get to it with Air too, MacBook Air as well. So on another one, it's on by default. So meaning like a lot of these issues seem to be more kind of geared towards the people that are bringing in the Apple Silicon. And also for GPT-4All, you see LangChain and Weave supports, and then this GPT-J, Llama, and MPT. Those are the three big ones as well. So they advertise this as basically this, as a free-to-use, locally running, privacy-aware chatbot, no GPU or internet required. So again, I ran all of this on a Core i7 that's aging at this point, 16 gigabytes, and I wouldn't want to go much lower than that. And especially, I wouldn't even consider getting a laptop that's 256 gigabytes if you're going to be downloading at least 5 gigabytes models all the time. I'd say the bare minimum is 512 and probably recommended at least a terabyte for like an SSD. So they say the benefits: free to use, locally running, privacy-aware chatbot, and provide your own text documents. Now, every time you see this is referring to, especially with the so you're going to be talking about RAG, so retrieval augmented generation. And the best I found out there, I've run a bunch of different RAG workflows, has been Raptor, which takes in a bunch at the same time. Now, in this specific case, and I'll show you with the desktop client what it looks like on the next slide. And it's basically you have these documents locally. So I pointed to 3 locally, and then it does an extra good job looking at those documents in relation to the prompt, as opposed to relying on the context of the large language model or LMM. Okay. So here's what it looks like. So the only thing I pretty much had to do after I fixed my own kind of like VS Code issues was this chmod with this linux.run. And then this is the GPT-4All installer. So again, if you're just watching this, on YouTube, or if you're tuning in, I would really try to get a desktop client to work. If you haven't ever done Python notebooks or notebooks or scripts before, this seemed to be the more this is working, this is more reliable. Now, what's shown here is basically this. I asked the same question. So this is a different framework, but same question. How has generative AI been used in cancer drug discovery? Now, my system, like I said, is kind of slow. It was like 4 tokens a second. which is approximately, like 3-4 words a second, something like that. And I get all of this information here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then it goes on and on and on. And so there's two ways of doing this. Basically, you can either you download the model. So where I put here, download Llama 3. In this case, I did instruct. Now, to do RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, which is the buzz term right now in all things GenAI, you're going to want to download SBERT or some similar embedding model. Now, what this does is it allows you to, in specific, look at your local documents that you provide. And then on top of that, yeah, I accidentally, you have to be a little careful for your directory. It's a good setup and everything, but you kind of want to double check. It's not, say it's like, mainstream is like an operating system. But what's shown here is basically in this yellow box, that means that I inputted these local documents, okay? So the 3 that I did was this drug discovery today paper and 2 of my PDFs, okay? And again, this is on the same Dell 16 gig RAM, Core i7 setup with Ubuntu. And for for this question, it did well. And you always want to check to, like, if you ask for something more specific, always refer back to the original documents as well. And it also does depend on your temperature value, your P value, your top 10K values, and that all can make a difference, right, as far as what type of output you're getting. So again, this is local. This is a downloaded Llama 3. I can hear the fan going up for sure. And I have a laptop cooler. I have a side fan too as well to keep the heat down, because that's happened to my other laptops. But basically, this was a really big step, for Chemical Q Device for myself, because it's basically, it's in a package, in the specific framework. I can go back to it tomorrow and it should work as long as I don't change directories and move things around my own desktop. So that's what I would do. If you're just tuning in, especially if you're just getting started with GenAI, definitely try to get a desktop client out of one of these. And the next one is Private GPT. So it's basically, they do the same type of thing with RAG, with high-level API abstracts. They also allow some low-level, modifications for advanced users. It's built on Fast API. And the one that I'm not including a lot here is OpenAI. Now, OpenAI started a lot of this, and they're responsible for this. They played a huge role in the GenAI. Now, only say GPT-2 or ChatGPT, or actually GPT-2 and below are openly available, but those are not competitive models anymore. So everything above GPT-2 is proprietary, and you can either access it through chat or you can access it through tokens, right? So I can say, GPT-4o, and then I can access that, and I can check and see how much it charged me. Now, OpenAI, I don't believe, has a competitive model for local when we're talking about this local environment here, especially with Llama and Mistral. We just had some Mistral news this week. They keep announcing new stuff. And so they say they're using RAG with Llama Index, okay, and Gradio UI client to test the API, and then some other features as well. Now, they say Private GPT is a production-ready AI project that allows you to ask questions about your documents using the power of large language models, and even in scenarios without an internet connection. Okay, so you have to have an internet connection. I'm hardwired now because it does help with the downloads, and it's just a more reliable connection as opposed to Wi-Fi. And you see, it feels like it's like an older setup, but that's what you need to develop on, is basically local hardware, with some, good or pretty good laptop. And then if you want to do something in the future, say have some interactions with iOS, with your GenAI. I don't know as far as how far you could take that. However, the developers conference is next month for Apple, so you can definitely tune in there. And so I had I wasn't able to get this one up as far as they did all this with. It's basically git clone GitHub, okay? And you're winding up in your VS Code terminal, and I could get to a certain point with this. So basically, there's ways of doing if you want to use, VS Code with Python scripts and terminal or just terminal, I think that's a really appealing option. Is just you can change temperature and all that stuff just within a terminal, which is kind of cool, which is just like a black screen. Now, with Llama C++, now this one in specific, this is what seems to be the one that is attracting the most attention as far as like, okay, obviously you're talking about using pure C++. And also they're saying, and this is the one metal. So this is, when you have this unified memory, shared between your CPU, GPU, and now your neural processing units, is it's enabled by default. And if you have never experienced GPU issues on Python notebooks, they exist. And, if you're an advanced coder, you could probably work through it, kind of quickly. But is frustrating to have to continuously, figure out your own hardware in order to, get to the next steps. So they're saying initial flash attention support and then multi-GPU pipeline parallelism. This is the only one that I saw that was like that, multi-GPU. And of course, the CUDA support and, even AMD GPU support as well. As far as I know, this is just one individual. So you could look them up just on GitHub there. Now, the thing that was interesting about this as well is you'll see a lot as far as, and again, when I say integer instead of float, so an 8-bit integer versus 4-bit. So 4-bit integer would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's no decimal place. And you can go all the way down to 1.5-bit. And that's the first time I've seen this. So why this matters is basically you get these models on your computer. They have to wind up in some, application, and you might need things that are just like good enough because you don't have the storage size, or they would take too long to run. And it'll be interesting, especially this month, to see what exactly Apple is implementing and with OpenAI too, as far as these local, and they're not even large language models, they're large multimodal models to deal with your, images and speech figure like Siri, these types of things, and with videos. And I've got a quote on that at the end. And they do actually say, so I would say this is a definite focus point here. Apple Silicon is a first-class citizen optimized for ARM Neon, Accelerate, and Metal framework. So Accelerate is Hugging Face, and Metal is in specific, it's on by default and is supposed to work well with the trio of processors that the like MacBook Pros have. So obviously the benefits is to enable LLM inference with minimal setup and state-of-the-art performance on a wide variety of hardware locally in the cloud. Now, this is the only one actually, I think he's actually just on GitHub. So I'll have to double check that with this one, but it's, the GitHub looks really good. Okay, so these are just some of the models, and this was a Google for Developers talk. And they use this nice interface here, so it's basically, I would definitely check out this video. So LLMs, Llama 3 is standard at this time, Mistral 7B. Mixtral can be somewhat bigger. Mixtral is kind of where it cuts off if you have like 16 gigs of, RAM on your computer. See, a lot of times you could download it, but then after it goes to run your prompt, it'll just crash the kernel. And that's not necessarily just desired. So just be aware of that. Mixtral is a mixture of experts. So it might be like a 7 by 8 billion, which is going to be, a significant number of gigs to put into RAM. Okay, so we also see Gemma here as well, and then Grok as well too. Now, I don't think everything is switching over to large multimodal, because it's probably for some time, even though Gemma builds up into Gemini for Google, even though, Meta.ai, you could do some of these things as well too. LMM's Lava, Baklava, Obsidian, and these types of things, it says it's supported. So again, this is just moving so fast that we'll have a much greater, basically understanding of LMMs. And how much is going to be applied to the phones in the fall, for their rollout, and what does it mean for developers? How much LMM research should we do? Because obviously you're going to be looking at pictures or video or text or speech like Siri or others too. Okay, so now it's Hugging Face here. So they say they have 100 awesome projects have used across the industry, and that it's built with their transformers. So their big libraries are transformers and accelerator. Accelerate is basically, for you need that if you want to use GPUs in the cloud. Okay, so they have thousands of pre-trained models, and you should be able to download a lot of these. Now, I was trying to get a text-to-text generation to work, and that's the one that kind of crashed. It was a Cohere model that was, I could download it, but I think it was a RAM issue for me. Another thing you need to check too, and I'll get to this too, is you can change in your VS Code or whatever IDE how much RAM that you allow. So mine was set to like 3,500 or megabytes, so 3.5 gigs, and you're going to have to bump that up. If you're dealing with just non-quantized models, like Llama 3 on its own is 16 gigabytes, but usually when you download it, it's much smaller. Okay, so it's an established framework. They're decently big. I would say a lot of it, the leaderboards and everything. A lot of people, if you get into GenAI, you're going to hear about Hugging Face pretty quickly. So they say Transformer, state-of-the-art machine learning for PyTorch, TensorFlow, and JAX. And out of all these that I've talked about, they're probably the one that's top, or if not one of the top, that have incorporated these other standard machine learning libraries. So when you go to use this locally, to do inference, is that a lot of times you can't use Hugging Face on its own. You have to use it with either PyTorch or one of these other two. And I think PyTorch is number one, and probably TensorFlow number two. Okay, and there's just a whole host of other ones. So again, you could download these thousands of different models, and I have a bunch of too, and you can, basically try to use them locally. And keeping in mind that if you want a Llama 3 substitute, for instance, you're going to have to stick to other models that say text generation, or there's other types of multimodal models too, but they have to be a specific category in order to be like a drop-in replacement. So what I got up and running on this was this terminal code. So pip install, you'll see git, and then this link. And then in specific, I had issues, and it was mostly because the size and some login issues. Is when I tried Llama 3, it downloaded 16 gigabytes, but I think because of the RAM on this thing, that didn't work too well. And then you can get other quantized models of Llama 3 that are in that 4 to 5 gigabytes. And those should work. So anyways, I stuck with the recommendation with just sentiment analysis, and I asked, how is cancer being addressed in generative AI drug discovery? Give me a specific example. Now, this one's a little bit different. It actually responds positive or negative, and its understanding of it. So it said it's 77.6% sure that this statement, how is cancer being addressed in GenAI drug discovery? Give me a specific example. It's saying about 77% sure that it's a negative statement, okay? Now, the model that I kept with this was GPT-2. So actually, I did use an OpenAI model, but this model is very aging at this point. And when you look at, seminars and kind of code longs, you really want to make sure, try to get the 2024s, because they typically run better as far as notebooks, or if you're trying to do some, code in terminal. So anyways, for this specific case, this top portion here, it worked with GPT-2, and a sentiment analysis is kind of like an easier task. And then a bump up would be like summarization. And then a bump up would be like text generation, which is the other ones that I did. Now, a good demo here is basically running a Hugging Face LLM on your laptop. It's good to see here in this specific case. And some of these that I ran, I could download the model, and it says it does inference right away, and then it just gets rid of the model right after that. So there's different ways of doing it, but typically if you're in a production environment, you want to do something, you download a model, it sits on your desktop, but that doesn't have to be the case, right? So it could download, run away, run it, and then delete it right after that. Okay, so this brings us to LangChain. Now, LangChain is kind of like the tie in between these two. They say Llama and Llama File will automatically utilize the GPU on devices that utilize Apple Silicon. So all of this is just, there's just a lot of macOS, Apple Silicon. Now, say, for instance, with Llama, it supports, Linux, Ubuntu, and macOS, and then on Windows, it's still in preview. So I would say for Linux and Microsoft OS, you probably want to be more of an expert. You've done many other types of AI projects before, and I'd say you probably get faster up to date if you use something like Mac OS. But again, with these, a MacBook Air, 24 gigs of RAM, that would probably be your starting point. I wouldn't even start with 16 gigs of RAM. It's just, for doing local inference, and if you have other things going on in your desktop too. So of course, and I've mentioned this before, no inference fee. So that's a big thing too, is if you're trying to create book reports, the only thing you're really limited by is even with the, top of the line, Apple laptops or, other brands too, it's not going to be near as good as like an A100 GPU or an L4 GPU that are like $8,000 on their own. And, you can chain like an L4 24 times 4, something like that, to get to 96 or 92 gigs for that specific one. So your laptop's not going to be as good as that. But if you have a little bit of time and you don't want to keep running up, if you want to use GPT-4o, but you figured out a fine-tuned model of, Llama 3 that you really, it's competitive with GPT-4o, or you think it is, then you're not going to get the per token output costs, okay? So your input tokens is the prompt, and it's based on the words that can get converted into numerical representations called tokens. Your output tokens, again, they'll come out as words, but they were converted into numerical representation. Now, in both of these things, if you go to do like top of the line GPT-4o, online, you get charged for both your prompt, so how long is your question, and you get charged again for your answer, okay? So you're going to have to get up there, because even I've done this in weeks past, I still didn't even occur $1 worth of charge on OpenAI. Now, in the ones that I was doing locally, either through prompting through the terminal or VS Code, or the one client, the desktop client, I think it's GPT-4All, I got a lot longer responses because the settings weren't limiting it, and it's not a big deal, right? Because it's just running, and you're not typically being charged for output tokens or the input tokens for the prompt. Okay, so LangChain pulls this all together, and so for instance, Llama CPP Python bindings can be used to use the GPU via Metal. So again, just imagine, and it kind of reminds me of the Google developer. Everybody's kept carrying these Apple laptops and say, why would you, these things are expensive. It's just, it's the ecosystem. Everybody uses them. We do need like a decent amount of hardware, on the GPU side and the CPU side. And then also, the RAM, and there's benefits of having, unified memory architecture. And also they said this, like a Mac M2 Max is 5 to 6 times faster than an M1. And that's basically showing like the devices that we'll be, using with this, they are getting a lot better, as time goes on. So that's due to the larger GPU memory bandwidth. Okay, so they say combine Ollama, Private GPT, GPT-4o, Llama CPP, and others to run LLMs locally. And of course, this is protecting your data. You can also get charged again, for commercial services with data. So that's just a thing to think about. And so this is, I got this up and running. So this is actually a Jupyter notebook with LangChain. And this one ran the best with a streaming standard out callback handler with Llama 3. And I couldn't fit everything on, but it took about 2 minutes to do about 365 words. And that's slow, right? This doesn't have a GPU. It's an i7, but, it's getting up there. But that's what it is. I mean, if you do anything medical or drug discovery, especially, preclinical and past the clinical trials, you're not going to be able to send patient data up. And who knows, you might actually have some awesome desktop to work on too, which I haven't mentioned. But I just, just in all these things, they're kind of recommending going in the direction of macOS. Okay, so as far as ease of use here is basically, they'll be used to aid the future of medical or medical too, mobile device software. And we're going to see that, especially so if you tune in next month, that is, the Apple, Worldwide Developer Conference. I believe it's all online. So that should be very interesting. And the huge buzz is that, they should be using they should be using OpenAI. And then it's pretty much kind of etched in that we're going to see some generative AI on local phones. So especially if you have clients that want to do things on their cell phones, figure you're going to be doing a lot of that, like working on your laptop or desktop, and then, what you want to wind up with your software there. So they said greater than 8 gigs of RAM is needed for 7 billion parameter models, maybe even more, 16 gigs for 13 billion. Now, I think these are for quantize. I don't think these are for, because the 8 billion Llama is like 16 gigabytes. So that puts it twice as much. So I think these are for quantize. So you can see how it goes up and up as far as memory concerns. And I think for the OSs, you're more looking at like a 4 gig for Linux and Windows for the OS, and then 8 gigs for, like a macOS. And like I said before, so you have to go into your settings in VS Code. If you're going to be running bigger models, you can download them. It'll let you download them, but then it'll just crash the kernel if you don't have the RAM allocated to VS Code to use. And I'd say the biggest pros is basically privacy, responsiveness. I didn't talk too much about latency. So everything's going to be lower latency by the time you request and something happens to run on, a specific device. And then the downside is, yes, you have to worry a lot more about hardware considerations, physical storage, as opposed to just, renting time off a Colab GPU. And it's going to be harder, especially if you want to fine tune and especially if you want to train an existing, pre-trained model like Llama 3. That's going to be pretty much off limits for a lot of like mid to low end laptops. You probably have to get pretty high up. And it's still going to be slower, right? You're not going to have that GPU bandwidth that like an L4 or, higher than that. Okay. And we should be getting H200s and A200s too. So again, across the board, you'll see things kind of put in like, Apple is a first-class citizen, these types of things. Different stages of drug discovery will utilize different GenAI technologies. So we saw this in a couple of them doing local RAG, which is, something that you could do on Colab as well. And it's just going to take a little bit longer time unless you have like a really awesome desktop. And then you can do comparisons between GPUs. But, typically I think a top consumer grade GPU is like 24 gigabytes. And then, you're going to, for fine tuning, and especially if you try to retrain the whole model. Okay, so base model, in my opinion, versatility will get more specific to your specific cases, but you'll probably still need to fine tune it, which means you have your original parameters, your pre-trained model for, Llama 3, and then it tacks on some additional kind of like approximated parameters, like LoRa, that type of thing. And then agentic workflow. So I covered this as well too. We'll also see additional improvements in accuracy and deployment. And it's at this point where the performance is usually better if you use some other type of Lang chain or Lang graph. But if you're giving it the software additional agentic responsibility, saying it can do more, it'll still take some time to get the better results using that. So what I want to focus on here is a CNN Business quote. And they said, imagine asking Apple Siri to show you an old photo taken from a child's second birthday or summarizing lengthy emails and writing drafts. Then consider Siri learning your schedule, preferences, and even your personality so it can better communicate with you throughout the day. So Apple is widely expected to partner with ChatGPT, maker OpenAI, ahead of its annual Worldwide Developers Conference in June, where it will likely show off its first batch of AI tools coming to the iOS software. So in my words, this is basically, it's practical. Generative AI is practical. The use cases that work really well, we should be using them. If there's not, everything goes back to like an FDA, probable benefit over probable risk. So is this helping something, with a high chance of success, with their schedule, and there's, guardrails and fail-proof kind of things over and over again, then, that feature with GenAI is going to be on cell phones. Are there any questions? So then if you joined a little late, it's basically, there's all of these different frameworks, to use. And like I said, I think all of these seem competitive. LangChain is more like it works with other local LLM platforms because it did list these other ones. But it's so kind of intertwined and interconnected with it that, that's just how it is. And then the other ones, like I said, was Llama C++, that seems to be the one that's on the bleeding edge of technology. And, when they mention the 1.5-bit quantized models, we have all seen 4-bit, and, just all of the different configurations, especially with Apple Silicon or Metal. And then Llama, it's supported by all of these other developments that you can do. And again, if you're just joining, or if you just saw this online, get a desktop chat client. So Llama, I got the GPT for all working. Private GPT has it as well. I don't believe Llama C++ does. And then I don't think Hugging Face has that as well. Now, the huge thing, basically for Hugging Face is it's a repository of all of these models, right? So in theory, if it's a text generation model and you're working locally on that, you download it and then you copy. So on huggingface.co, you copy, say the author's name / model, copy that, and then put that in the quotes, and it should run, right? So it's just you're not going to have access to GPT 4.0. That's proprietary. The Llama 3, there's been other iterations or other fine tunings of getting the context window up to 1 million tokens, and doing all these other tricks that you can do. And it's a pretty competitive model. And then on top of that, it's open source, right? So you're not charged for all these input and output tokens. So I think it changes the way I think, because I always think I need to keep my prompt small. But now, and especially there's Andrew Ng, he says with this advanced kind of agentic workflows that you can make your prompt like a page, a book report. And if you have an agent that works really well, it'll go off and scour, whatever it needs to. So that's an option there too. Yeah, so, there's just a lot of different things to work with. I saw there's something in the chat here. How much MacBook do you get for $2,000? So you can get like a MacBook Air, $2,100 right now for 24 gigs. And that's kind of like a top model, but it's only like a 15.3-inch screen, which is probably just a little bit small. And, the pros, so the 16 pros, that's more like, if you price one out to like 36 gigs of RAM and like a terabyte storage, that's like 3,100. So yeah. So the other question here, yeah. So $2,000 for 64 gigs, 40 tops, which I'm sure is probably pretty good. Yeah. So maybe that's for like a desktop, and that sounds good, right? Because most of the RTX kind of NVIDIA personal ones is, more so for consumer or for like gaming, that type of stuff. Yeah, so I started off doing all this. Basically, there were a couple different notebooks to work with. And then, so MIT LAM had this big paper. So they had done beta sheets. It's basically, you say you want a specific beta sheet or AlphaFold, and then it'll produce a protein with that degree of secondary structure. And then the one I worked on was more kind of like, it's called force pooling. So if you want a protein with a specific force pool, then the software, and you can check that, you should watch it on YouTube. So I took that and then I created, 8 new proteins, and then it tied it in with other developments that I was working on. Now, the other ones that's really interesting is called ChemCrow. So let's try to think here. So ChemCrow is basically you have you have a prompt, and it's saying like, okay, in a sentence or two, I want this specific molecule. The GenAI kind of does everything. It sends it off to a robo reaction, and it creates it, obviously with safeguards. And there's been other ones too with that as well. There's at least one other one I covered. So, a lot of these, the GitHubs are kind of open, so you could take a look at the GitHubs too. So yeah, I would check out, it's LAM MIT for the first one. It's called Force Pool with kind of Gen AI kind of stuff. And, ChemCrow. There's one other one. They were using agents as well. And then, that's an additional option there too. Any other questions? So feel free to put in the chat. And so basically, the big thing is like you have to decide what you want to run locally, what you want to run, online. And if you can't send the data up to an LLM, then you have to run locally. That's just, there's going to be no other way around that. And then can you get away with, saying doing a desktop model with, 64 gigs of RAM sounds really good. Where right now I can only run it like an A100 on, 40 gigs of RAM, but I know they make 80. So that might be an option there too. And the thing that's pretty much off limits, I say for a lot of laptops or, kind of entry desktops is going to be fine tuning and retraining the whole model. So that typically requires, it's not inference. So a lot of these you can have, good, NVIDIA has services that are CPUs just to run inference all the time.
Kevin, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. This was very useful. I was wondering if you have actually done anything in drug discovery with these models, or you just explain how they can be used in the process.
Yeah, I just told you. So watch the other YouTube videos.
Okay, so I had the difficulty with hearing you. I had to switch devices. I missed a few sentences.
There's a fair amount of research. There's a really good paper. So the one that I pulled off of, and these can be adapted to whatever, right? So this in specific is this drug discovery today. So I've used this for different RAG workflows, and I ask it, a specific question and it returns. So then you have to adapt it to whatever you're doing. And, for something like if you're, measuring the force pull based on some other data sets, and then now, you want a specific force pull, there's a big, Python notebook out there by MIT. And the ChemCrow 2 is you can look onto GitHub and you can see, you want a specific molecule, and you have to adapt it to what you're doing, So the drug discovery today, I would say it's a 2024, this link, the number 10, it goes through a lot of these, and then, everything needs, for your specific application, you'll have to fine tune it to that or customize it to that.
Okay. Is it possible to post the link for the paper to the
So
chat?
this will be up. So like I said, this is number 10 for the reference. I should have this up on LinkedIn. This will be up on YouTube. So if you're looking for any information from this, that every video and everything is on Chemical Q device. So chemical, the letter Q, and then device on YouTube. And then the GitHub is under my name. So it's Kevin Kochak. There's no spaces. So you can access all of the PDFs, just a ton of notebooks. It's probably like the leading one for GenAI plus quantum inspired and tensor networks and, putting all that stuff together now. So okay. Yeah, and then LinkedIn, you can get to you can download this and get to the references, and I should have it up in later today.
Perfect. And do you work with others to actually do these projects, or you just an educator, you just show people how to do it?
So like I said, I have the biggest code repository that focuses on GenAI with the other areas of research that I've done. So like tensor networks are going to be huge for, models and, fixing explainability, these types of things.
Okay, but do you work like as a consultant or collaborator with others to do the actual work, or you don't?
Check out the GitHub.
Okay. Okay, because repository is something, if you work with others, is another line of business, right? Okay. Okay, this has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions? So feel free to put in the chat. And, if you're just getting started, just get some wins in, so you have to adapt everything to your specific application. I can't do the work for you. And then, if it's a simple, prompting like this, you can ask this and it's a book report. And if you point it to a specific source, like your RAG sources, with Raptor, which is a previous discussion, they use I think 10. So you can look at 10 local documents all at the same time and then get better answers. And, if you don't run anything with it, it'll all kind of pass by. And I would say after this fall, kind of the door is going to be narrowing a little bit because it's going to get so advanced and, it's just going to take longer to catch up with, say, the emerging developments. Any other questions? So I see a couple people kind of returning from previous episodes, and the biggest thing I go to is on the weekends. There's a couple different AI calls I go to Saturday and then different ones Sunday. Is you just have to just do it, And if you've never run, Colab before, this is more kind of like VS Code terminal, scripts or just working straight out of terminal. There's no other way around it. And I've had people approach me all along the way. And it's just until I get that sense where everybody wants to work on it. And they say well, I just ran LangChain with, GPT-4All, and then it's this specific thing. But it's super technical. And I would say if you're not good at implementing this to your application, that's going to be a struggle there too. But for instance, this is simply a Python notebook. And, it's going to take a little bit longer on, just decent laptop. And you can customize this to, basically however you want. So bigger next week with all the Apple stuff. I'll probably do an Apple talk pretty soon. I don't know if it'll be next week. But basically, everything moves so fast. Now, one of the groups that I go to on Sundays, the gentleman said, by the time you pick a model and you hit deploy, it's already out of date. And that's kind of is that supposed to be a good thing? But that's just how it works, because if you think of all the recent developments with Llama 3, we just heard from Mistral, and they're doing commercial stuff with IBM. GPT-4o didn't come much longer than a month after that, and Gemini, so Google Gemini. And, you can use, different aspects of Gemini on, Google Sheets and Docs and these types of things as well. So it's kind of all coming right now. And I would say now is that tipping point where it's just the performance is good enough. And I would say it's opened up a lot of utility, and that we've been able to, as an industry, kind of figure out, say, this can work in this specific application for this specific case. So we're going to see that with, I think it's iOS 18. And, basically this, if you do anything in medical, it's going to have to be local to it. But if you don't understand the tech or anything behind all the different frameworks, that it's going to be a tough sell. So if you go into national labs or leading companies, how many of these different frameworks do they use? And to what degree do they use them? So if it's just they use they probably use one or two of these, maybe C+ or Llama CPP, OLlama, but there's going to be developments from all around. And, there's definitely, I think from a developer's point of view with performance and scalability, going with Llama CPP, and then still using LangChain to support it. So but yeah, it's the same thing. If I go to other meetups and nobody's really talking, it's just like it's awesome, but it's like, you know, you just have to find a way to develop somehow. It's not beyond you. And if you can get a client, like one of these local clients, and start working with it and just ask it questions. And even before then, go to meta.ai. You can go to Grok, GROQ, and Gemini, you know, so there's a big push for multimodal. So you can do, you know, these types of multimodal queries on Gemini right now, which is Google's. And it's just, it's the time, you know, it's the time for Gen AI, and there's really no other way. I mean, I got in at the perfect time because there was people working on this tech, and they were frustrated that none of the previous GPTs were high performance, and they were just kind of like from the technology, a lot of the stuff that I was working on prior, you know, it has to work really well. And I'd say Llama, the original one, was actually not open sourced. Llama 2 was, I think that was last July. And I think Llama 2 was a huge thing because anytime you're talking about running locally, you don't want to pay, and you don't want to pay for tokens, and you don't want to pay for data, you know, storage or access. That just opened the door, right, is Llama 2. And then also with Mistral, so Mistral, mixture of experts as well. And we see that, so with these here, this 7 billion MOE right here is they actually have a commercial contract with IBM now, but I think they're still going to be tending to the open source community as well. And like I said, I need to learn more as far as the large multimodals, but I do hear a lot about lava, and then here you have baklava. So sometimes it's just the name comes first, and that's how these things are. But yeah, I think the tipping point is coming soon. And I would love for people to put in the chat and just say, oh, I work on this stuff as well with, you know, all this type of software. And that would be awesome to see. So it's like, I started this 137 discussions ago, consecutive weeks. I haven't missed a week. And it would just be awesome. And this comes up in more like my Sunday, you know, to actually do something with it, right? To run the demos. These YouTube discussions are great. This one in specific, this Google for developers, this is really good as well. And a lot of times it doesn't take much to set it up, but if you're coming from just not doing coding for a while, you're going to have some errors, right? And you have to install new things, or say if you removed a file by accident and then reinstall VS Code, these things come with the territory. But, you know, the technical side, if you just say you have an application, something in medical, but you don't understand all of the nuances with this and how everything goes together, then you don't really, right? You're probably running just, you know, some framework that somebody else said to do. So my experience with all of this is there is so much more than I ever thought there'd be, as far as all the different LLMs. And even with this Drug Discovery Today paper for GenAI, you know, I read a good portion of that, and, you know, it's still like, well, how do you technically do these things? They're not going to tell you. Like, you have to actually read the papers or do the code on yourself. And then now you have your own data, and then you incorporate it. So that's my experience with it, is if you don't have the technology down and you go straight to application, then, you know, how much different, how much better can you explain to people that your approach is, right? So it's challenging, and some of these notebooks do get up there as far as complexity, and the MITs, and like I said, with some of the Chemcro stuff, it's up there as well. But I love to hear in the chat, and especially like, you know, your coding journey with all these things. I personally don't see like the benefit of just, you know, I don't go to as many meetups because I focus on the material code, get the notebooks up, you know, and then kind of on to the next thing is the next week kind of stuff. So any other questions? Any other comments or questions? Yeah, so I'd say this is, if you really want to get into this is kind of the goal right here. Get to a client, right? If you can't get to a client, then it's going to be a tough road. Um, and like I said, with this specific one, it has a file. I think I put it on my desktop and then I just run this, and then it's not too bad. So, anybody else that we haven't heard from? And I could go through all of this because it does help me too, to keep teaching it. If you don't know what a vector database is basically you typically need these for RAG workflows. And this is an online version, is Weaviate. So you'll hear of Weaviate a ton. And with these other ones, like that run locally, you could also run, 3 documents or plus at a time to, if you're doing R&D, to really focus in to try to get the specific answers as well. Anything else? So I think the thing to really keep an eye on, I try to touch into the news every once in a while, is the development with edge devices and, how is everybody going to be interacting with Gen AI, by the end of the year. And like I said, we'll find out a lot more at the developers, conference for next month. And, so this is just, it's a lot of, it moves really fast. And again, if you don't get in now, it's going to be really hard to kind of like develop at a later time. And like I said, there's a lot of other people that did LLMs where they weren't, high performance. And I would say maybe that tipping point was like the GPT-2 to the GPT-3 or 3.5, so 3.5 is a high performing large language model. And, that's why we're seeing all this buzz with Google and, other big companies. You just have to implement. And again, so I'll have all this up. So this will be on LinkedIn, and then also this will be, everything is on YouTube. So if you missed the past, I basically, there was 9 before this with large language models, especially tensor networks. And then going into like these really like key libraries to focus on. So. Then feel free to ask any questions at this point. And, if you're just getting started, where do you start? Definitely, Hugging Face. It's called Hugging Face Pipelines. So I'll put this in the chat. So what Pipelines does is it allows you to very quickly run different types of Gen AI categories, right? So say, for instance, like, you have text summarization, text to text generation, or other multimodal things. And you can get to kind of like the code on a lot of the model pages. So if you go to Hugging Face, it's just huggingface.co. You just go there. And if you look at the leaderboard, you just click on models and it'll be all of the most recent models. And a lot of them are text generation, and there's some embeddings, like you have to use an embedding for RAG workflows. So. And then GitHub too. So if you don't have a GitHub, definitely get a GitHub. It's kind of like, that's where all these others live, is on GitHub. Especially, LangChain's huge, and Hugging Face. The only one that's not as much onto the other ones is the C++. I think it's just one individual, and then he focuses just on GitHub. So. And the other ones, so there's definitely go to a lot of these meetups, like to do AI and like to code. It helps out a lot. There's some in Austin, there's some in Boston. There's one here in San Diego. And you pretty much just type in AI. If that doesn't work, try Python. But just a heads up, like people that there's a lot of people that don't do AI that are just doing kind of like more Python and those types of things. But if you type in GenAI or LLM or LMM, you should be able to find those as well. Awesome. Any other kind of last questions or comments here? So I appreciate everybody coming on. This has been Thursday, May 30th, 2024. And this is for local generative AI model frameworks for different stages of drug discovery. My name is Kevin Kotchak, and appreciate everybody coming on. Have a good rest of the day, and have a great rest of the week. Take care, everybody.